Is NATO for show? Is the World Bank for show? Is the International Monetary Fund for show? Have they done nothing? Stephen Miller, the deputy White House chief of everything, tweeted after World War II, the West did this horrible thing where instead of doing the real good victory, they let all the third world in their countries and then they became weak. This is a paraphrase. That is like putting a tattoo of, I haven't read a book on your fucking forehead, because the post-World War II order was written by America, largely in conjunction with a lot of other people too. As I again have been saying for a really long time now, 10 years, the rise of Trumpism is directly an expression of fatigue and irritation about that, and a misapprehension, I think, that that entire order was contrived as a scam that rips off America without sort of seeing the benefits that America gleaned from it. We're seeing what we're going to break that order looks like. And one of the things it's going to look like is that America is going to shred its own soft power. It's going to act like a regional bully. He's going to do it in such a way that will eventually, I think, undermine NATO.